Welcome back. Let's discuss hormones, namely thyroid hormones and female hormones. I'd like to share with you a few studies that were recently published, go through them and help you understand how gluten impacts thyroid function, how pesticides impact thyroid function, heavy metals and their impact on thyroid function, vitamin D and the impact on autoimmunity, also selenium and myo-inositol and the beneficial role they play for thyroid protection, touch on a new fungus that's been shown to be helpful for thyroid function, thyroid autoimmunity, and for energy levels, and hit on one study looking at an interesting herb for balancing female hormones. All the while, the one thing I'm most keen to do with you is think critically. So what we'll do together, if you'll join me, is critically think through how we apply these research study findings to your life. Welcome to Dr. Ruscio Radio, providing practical, science-based insights into health. We break through the bias and the noise to bring you simple, trustworthy information that matters. And to kick things off, where I definitely feel we need to think more critically is with a gluten-free diet. Certainly can be helpful, but let's talk about the nuance. Great paper was just published, 2023 meta-analysis, summarizing 4 studies in about 90 Hashimoto's or autoimmune thyroid patients. They found that a gluten-free diet did reduce thyroid antibodies or TPO antibodies by about 200 points, which is great. However, they only found that reduction in those who had either celiac or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, NCGS, meaning there was a clear, reproducible symptomatic reaction to gluten. And here is what the authors commented that I want to sort of unpack. Evidence is not yet sufficient to recommend this diet, gluten-free, to all patients with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. I can completely appreciate if you went to your conventional endocrinologist and they said, oh, diet has nothing to do with your thyroid health. That felt dismissive. It felt as though they weren't minding the research literature like this meta-analysis exemplifies. But there is a balance between that and making the claim that everyone with Hashimoto's must avoid gluten. This does not seem to be the case because remember, it was only people in this study who either had celiac or had NCGS. And this is where, again, you have a reproducible, symptomatic negative response when you ingest gluten. Here is another paper we can use as this exercise of critical thinking sort of kicks off. 2014 observational study by Volta and colleagues at the University of Bologna. Why this paper was so important? They looked at over 12,000 people with suspected non-celiac gluten sensitivity, people who had gastrointestinal pain, bloating, diarrhea, nausea, brain fog, fatigue, and joint pain. This was an earnest attempt, over 60-point assessment to try to better understand these individuals, the symptoms they had, and if they truly had non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or maybe they didn't. They found that 3% of individuals had non-celiac gluten sensitivity. There is clearly a cohort, a subset of people who have a symptomatic aversion to gluten, but it's not 100% of people. But wait, I've been told that everyone with Hashimoto's should avoid gluten because Hashimoto's is autoimmune and gluten fuels autoimmunity because the gluten protein gliadin looks very similar to thyroid tissue, and on goes the speculation. This is where if we have research, we can get a better idea of what the theory looks like in the real world. So coming back to this paper, within that 3%, within the 3% that expressed clear symptomatic reactivity to gluten in this fairly well-designed study, the 3% breaks down as follows. 47% of those people, remember this is of the 3%, 47 had IBS, irritable bowel. So this is the digestive complaints. 35 had food intolerances of whatever sort to other foods, dairy, maybe they didn't do well with fiber. 22% had allergy as an environmental allergy. 14% had autoimmune disorders. And if we double click on that, we see 9 of that 14 was autoimmune thyroid. So, yes, there are people with Hashimoto's who should avoid gluten, but it's not everyone. In fact, of the 3% of the population that was screened, and these are people at risk for a non-celiac gluten sensitivity, of that 3%, 9 had autoimmune thyroid. Now, I want to tie why this matters in 1 second, but first, please subscribe and comment. And also, if you feel this would help one person, please share it. Okay, so then how do we account for the clear observation that people will go gluten-free and they will see improvements in how they feel? Well, firstly, we cannot ignore that when people go on a gluten-free diet, oftentimes they are cutting out other unhealthy foods. They may eat out less. They may eat more whole, fresh foods. They may cut out processed foods. That's one. The other, and this is what I think is so misunderstood, and we actually have a researcher who specializes in just this slotted to come on the podcast soon to really unpack. But remember that the most common high FODMAP foods are also what is cut out on a gluten-free diet: wheat, rye, and barley. So what I think happens is people are experiencing the benefit more commonly for two reasons. One, improvements in food quality, and two, they've reduced FODMAPs in their diet, these prebiotic-rich foods that are very well studied and identified to improve digestive symptoms in people with irritable bowel syndrome. And when we come back to the diagram from Volta, and we see that in this cohort with NCGS, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, 47% have irritable bowel, it makes complete sense that what might be happening in the majority of cases is the reduction of FODMAPs and therefore prebiotics is allowing a balancing of the microbiota, reducing gas, reducing pressure, reducing pain, reducing inflammation, reducing leaky gut, all which have been shown in clinical trials. And this is where the benefit's coming from. Here's why this matters in my mind so much. FODMAP intolerance is temporary. Non-celiac gluten sensitivity, if it's immunogenic, tends to be permanent. So this can be very freeing. And what this means and how we should translate this is, for most people, the gluten sensitivity that they're experiencing is FODMAP related. And because FODMAP tolerance has been well demonstrated to improve over time, tells us that most people will not need to strictly avoid gluten forever. Bear all this in mind. Ultimately, like I have said so many times before, because I care about you. I care about you hitting that correct level of avoidance, not doing too little avoidance, not caring too little about your food quality, but not going too far in the other direction, coming down the slope of the law of diminishing returns, and perhaps seeing some of the very symptoms pop up that you're trying to contend with. Yes, gluten reactivity as non-celiac gluten sensitivity is a real thing. Maybe 3% of the population. And of that 3%, within that 3%, 9% is autoimmune thyroid. Okay, this gives, I think, solace and a reason for some people to account for their gluten reactivity. However, don't forget about the fact that the majority of these people who have gluten reactivity, it seems to be IBS and FODMAP related. And this, excitingly, encouragingly, can be improved and tolerance can increase. And therefore, you can have at very least some gluten in your diet, some food freedom, and not be shackled by this fearful belief that because you have thyroid autoimmunity, you must avoid gluten forever. Let's go on to pesticides and chemicals and how these may impact thyroid function. A pretty interesting meta-analysis was published just last year, 9 studies looking at pesticide exposure and finding a 20% increased risk of thyroid dysfunction, whether it be overt hypothyroidism or sluggish thyroid, aka subclinical hypothyroid. This is important. Now, we should mention one disqualifier, because when I looked at this study, the first question I had was, well, is this dietary consumption, or is this a cohort study looking at people who handle, mix, apply pesticides. That's actually the case for this study. Most of this data is in people who have occupational exposure, which is going to be significantly higher than people who are just eating, let's say, conventional produce. However, I should mention that there is another paper in existence that looked at dietary intake and found something similar, that there is a correlation with the dietary intake, so not occupational work exposure, but actually what you're putting in your mouth, and a increased risk for either hypothyroid or sluggish thyroid. So I think this does reinforce that we should be cognizant to aim, whenever possible, for organic food. Now, remember that statement, because I try to be very specific with the statements. We want to aim for organic whenever possible. Plant that seed, come back to it in a moment. One sidebar I want to make really quick about environmental plastics, because I think this is also relevant. 2023 observational study did find that when people had higher urinary phthalate levels, and phthalates are found in many plastics, there was about a 76% increase of sluggish thyroid. So things like shampoos, lotions, hairsprays, deodorants, and plastic containers all may contain phthalates. You can look at the Environmental Working Group's website and simply type in the product you're concerned about and get their assessment of how clean or potentially laden with things like phthalates it may be. Okay, so then coming back to critical thinking, we covered that even dietary, non-occupational exposure, but dietary intake of pesticides is correlated with poor thyroid health. Let me now cut to me as a person living in the world. I recently ordered food online. I ordered organic blueberries. What I was delivered were conventional blueberries. And knowing that conventional blueberries are part of the dirty dozen, some of the most pesticide-laden foods, those blueberries sat in my refrigerator for about 2 days. And I had this internal struggle. Do I eat them? It's a carton of blueberries, $8 maybe. I'm not really so much concerned about the money, but I'm more so concerned about, can I justify throwing out a perfectly good carton of blueberries when people are starving in the world? But the pesticides. This got me thinking back to a video we released a few weeks ago on the best foods for brain fog. Now, one of those foods and one of the studies, or I should say one of the few studies, were meta-analyses, so summarizing multiple clinical trials, finding that consumption of blueberries can improve cognitive function in healthy and can slow down and may even reverse mild cognitive decline in those with cognitive impairment. And these studies weren't specifying or recommending only organic blueberries. In fact, I would assume that most of these studies were using conventional blueberries. So I said to myself, well, let me use science to sort of bridle one finding and come to the conclusion that the net impact of blueberries may be beneficial. Now, would organic blueberries be better than conventional? Yes, but we have clear data demonstrating that conventional blueberries, which will have pesticides in them, are good for your brain. Another example would be fish consumption. We know that fish, even fish that aren't known to specifically be high in mercury, salmon, let's say, have some mercury in it, but they also contain omega-3s. We have pretty impressive data showing that consumption of these fish improve cognitive function, or they reduce the risk of cognitive decline over time, and they improve neurological development in children. The beneficial impacts of the omega-3s and maybe the iodine outweigh the negative impact of some mercury. I share all this just to help give you the middle ground so you don't go too far in gluten avoidance and too far in pesticide avoidance, bearing in mind that just because a food may contain something in it that's bad for you, the net impact of a healthy food may negate the negative impact of one component in that healthy food. So the sort of rules or the heuristics here, in my view, would be first, aim for good, high food quality. Non-processed foods, meat, fish, eggs, fruits, and vegetables. And then secondly, the second thing you're trying to do is opt for organic foods and avoid things like plastics. I think this is the most practical perspective to have so we don't create neuroticism around food. And sort of in support of this, there was a interesting study published that did not find exposure to lead worsened thyroid function. 2023 observational study, 187 hypothyroid patients looked at next to 197 normal thyroid patients. They measured blood lead, and they did not find that higher blood lead was associated with worse TSH, T4, or thyroid antibodies. Now, am I saying go expose yourself to lead with no concern? Absolutely not. The point I'm trying to make is not all exposure to things that could be bad are going to have a noticeable impact on your health. And we want to just be a little bit careful not to live in a bubble, so to speak. And sure, do everything we can to have high quality food, eat organic, reduce exposure to plastics and heavy metals, but not be neurotic about it. Moving on to vitamin D. Pretty interesting study. One adding to a whole growing body of evidence showing that vitamin D improves thyroid autoimmunity. 2023 randomized control trial. They gave people either placebo, no treatment, or 800 IU per day of vitamin D. And this is not a very high dose. At 6 months, they found a 50-point reduction in TPO antibodies and also improved TSH and T4, leading these researchers to comment, vitamin D supplementation can effectively slow progression of hypothyroidism, improve thyroid function, and reduce thyroid antibody levels. Now, let's look at a meta-analysis because that was one clinical trial. Let's look at what happens when we summarize 12 studies in just under 1,000 patients, either having placebo or vitamin D. In this study, the vitamin D dose ranged from 1,000 up through to 7,000, and they found that when taking vitamin D for more than 3 months, there was about a 200-point reduction in TPO antibodies and also improvements in TSH and in free T4. So growing evidence showing that one reasonable thing you can do to improve your thyroid function and autoimmunity is supplementation with vitamin D. It's also important to bear in mind that the effect that we're seeing is 50 points to about 200. Just to bear that in mind in terms of having an expectation you can set associated with the use of vitamin D. Selenium is another compound that is central to the Hashimoto's or thyroid autoimmunity conversation. 2023 meta-analysis, 7 clinical trials, about 340 Hashimoto's patients were given selenium or nothing in the control group. The selenium dose ranged from 50 to 200 micrograms per day, standard dosing, and they found about a 280-point reduction in TPO antibodies. And they also found that over 6 months of treatment or supplementation seemed to be the most effective. And my recommendation here, based upon a few studies that have looked at a combination of selenium and myo-inositol, 83 or roughly 80 micrograms of selenium for 6 months and 600 milligrams of myo-inositol. Again, there's a couple studies that have found better results when combining myo-inositol with selenium than with selenium alone. Another potential option is a fungus, Cordyceps, aka caterpillar fungus. This has a traditional use in Chinese medicine for centuries. The interesting thing about this compound is it's actually a fungus that infects and mummifies the larva of certain caterpillars, and then the fungus emerges from the caterpillar's head. I think we have an image here. So maybe a touch gross, but let's look at the effects. Mechanistically, this compound, Cordyceps, can modulate the immune system. It's antibacterial, and it also appears to increase oxygen carrying capacity. What's interesting is this 2023 meta-analysis of 14 clinical trials that found Cordyceps could lead to just under 300 reduction points in TPO levels, can improve T4 levels, and can improve an inflammatory marker, TNF-alpha. The one thing that gives me pause is that when we went, and hopefully you are coming to realize that we really do fact check and drill down into these studies, because we wanted to see, well, how big was the effect on TPO specifically? Only one of the 14 studies that were included in this meta-analysis were we able to find indexed in PubMed. So what that tells me is that the other 13 studies may not be of high enough rigor and quality to be accepted for indexing inside of PubMed, which would make me take the results of this Cordyceps meta-analysis with a grain of salt. Still something to maybe trial, but there might be some issues with lack of quality in those studies that were included. Coming over to female hormones, a 2023 meta-analysis found some pretty impressive benefits for menopausal symptoms using black cohosh. In this meta-analysis, they summarized 22 studies in over 2,300 women given either placebo or black cohosh with an undisclosed dose. They found that black cohosh improved overall menstrual symptoms and hot flashes. One of the things I find interesting about black cohosh, amongst a few mechanisms, is the ability for black cohosh to modulate the estrogen receptor. Black cohosh appears to be adaptogenic. If you have too much estrogen, it brings down the high load. If you have not enough, it helps give you some stimulation to get you to more of an adequate position. So something to consider if you are in the transition and having some symptoms. I also wanted to cover a few studies looking at exercise and mindfulness and how they impact sleep. 2022 meta-analysis, 16 clinical trials. They found that either mindfulness or exercise, whether it be moderate or low intensity, improved sleep quality. Mindfulness can impact the limbic system and specifically the amygdala. This study I found very interesting. It's one of a growing number of studies that are putting people into functional MRIs, showing them disturbing images, and scanning their brains, then having them do some mindfulness or do nothing and getting back in, rescanning the brains, looking at the startling images again, and seeing what happens regarding the activation of the amygdala. The control group, those who did nothing, had significantly higher levels of activation of the amygdala, which governs fear, than did those who completed the mindfulness work. There was a much lower activation of the amygdala, a much lower fear and potentially anxiousness response when performing mindfulness meditation. And this same thing has been demonstrated for walking in nature. And this is one of the reasons why I've been such a proponent of walking in nature. Not only has time in nature been shown to reduce your chance of death from any cause, when something in your life happens that will irritate you, make you feel fearful, you will have a documentable lowering of the activation of the amygdala, which is probably why people report higher levels of well-being, vigor, and energy when they walk in nature weekly. 2 hours is probably the best target. If you can do 20 minutes a pop, great. And also remember that one study did look at, does it matter if I walk in dense woods, by a lake, in a park, by an ocean? Doesn't seem to matter. So whatever nature you have access to, go for it. Okay, so in summary, gluten-free does offer some benefit for those with thyroid autoimmunity, but only in those who have documented either celiac or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. The need for gluten-free dieting at least appears to be overstated in that for most people, it's probably reducing the FODMAP content in the diet. And remember that people's FODMAP tolerance over time has been shown to improve quite nicely. So you may not need to avoid food forever if you have Hashimoto's. I know that's counter-narrative, but when you fact check, this is the only reasonable conclusion you can come to. Remember that pesticides and plastics can have a deleterious effect on your health, but also bear in mind the health promoting effects of, let's say, blueberries may outweigh the negative effects of the pesticides therein if they are not organic. We covered one study finding no correlation between lead and thyroid function, and a few studies on vitamin D, selenium, and myo-inositol and their ability to improve thyroid function and thyroid autoimmunity. We talked about Cordyceps, the fungus popping out of the larva's head that may improve thyroid function, although I'm unclear on how high quality some of the studies in that meta-analysis were, and that black cohosh can improve menstrual symptoms and hot flashing, and finally, that exercise and meditation can reduce the stress response and be helpful for sleep. And hopefully these are all behaviors that you're integrating into your life, and hopefully some of these behaviors are giving you more of a relaxed perspective regarding diet. All right, guys, well, again, please comment and please share this. I'll be curious to hear what you think. And as the usual, I hope this helps you improve your health.